All right, good morning, everyone. We'll just have the last few folks wander in and we'll close the doors there. So great to see everyone in person. I don't know about you, but I'm really happy to be in person at a conference. It's been such a great turnout so far. And certainly such an amazing keynote this morning. I don't know about you, I'm certainly reinvigorated from that. I'll be thinking about that for a few days or weeks. The other silver lining, it's raining right now, but hopefully it'll get it out of the system so that when we're on the gondola later today, we'll enjoy the sunshine and maybe see the sunset even. I think that's how rain works, in July especially, in Whistler at least. So everyone, welcome to session 24, Analysis, Action, and Anecdotes, Combining Public and Private Voices. If that's not what you're here for, you're in for a pleasant surprise. Make sure you get scanned at the door for your CPLs if you haven't already. Please turn off your cell phones and personal devices so we can avoid any embarrassing ringtones. Kermit the Frog, I'm looking at you. A few people heard that one yesterday. The format today is 45 minutes presentation where Anne will be getting you involved, and will follow by a 30-minute Q&A ending on or before 12:15, hopefully before everyone's stomachs start growling for lunch. This is a hybrid session, so we'll be on video. Hey Mom, how's it going? For those viewing online, the session will be available to them 24 hours after the live session and for 2 weeks on the online session, on the online platform rather. A reminder, this conference is on social media and you can be too. Hashtag Elevation 2022, hashtag Plan to Elevate, or tag us at elevation_2022. Share all your photos and commentary beyond this room and beyond the conference, and a little humble bragging about being in Whistler when some of your coworkers aren't is never hurts either. So before I introduce our speaker, I'll introduce myself. My name is Alex Taylor. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm currently a public space planner at the City of Vancouver, also a PIBC board member. I'm proud to welcome the planners from all over the country here to BC. I live on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and I thank them for having cared for the land that I now call home, and I look forward to continue to working with them in partnership as we create a great city and region and province together. However, a land acknowledgement is just a tiny component of reconciliation. I would encourage all of you to reflect on how, in your professional and personal lives, we are lifting up Indigenous people and cultures as the right holders of these lands. Reconciliation and decolonization are central to advancing equity. Over the past year, my work team has been undertaking training on cultural safety and decolonizing our practices, and the PIBC board is also undertaking these initiatives this year so that we can better decolonize planning. On a personal note, my family and I are monthly supporters of Reconciliation Canada, and I encourage all of you to reflect on how you can further support reconciliation in your lives and in your communities. I have the privilege this morning of introducing Dr. Anne McAfee. During her 32 years at the City of Vancouver, 12 as co-director of planning, Anne combined analysis and action to develop housing and citywide policies. After supposedly retiring 16 years ago, she founded City Choices Consulting, where she continues to provide her wise planning insight. She is a fellow of the Canadian Institute of Planners, adjunct professor at UBC's School of Community and Regional Planning, member of Canada's National Housing Council, member of LAA International Honorary Land Economic Society, and a Kevin Lynch Award recipient. She has more than 200 publications to her name, and Google tells me that she's a judge in the Canadian Mortgage Awards as well.
Not sure about that one.
Most recently, actually yesterday, she was quoted by the Globe and Mail's Francis Beulah in a story on how the new Vancouver plan, which is going to council this week, compares to the 1990 city plan process, which I'm sure she will touch on a little bit this morning, and why it may succeed or fail. And while on Twitter, Francis elaborated on the loads Anne had to say that she couldn't fit into the story, she did concede that Anne is one more retired planner. There are so many of them around. But I am so pleased to be able to introduce her today and hear what she thinks about the current state of planning. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ann McAfee.
Thank you, Alex, and welcome to everybody. I will be talking about reconciliation in a few minutes. It's part of one of my tools for planning. What I'm going to chat about is looking at some of the context that we as planners over the last 50 years had the opportunity to work with urban and rural small village environments to create plans. But then wondering how many of those plans and the tools we used actually will be useful tomorrow. And I've got two tools that I think may help tomorrow. Finishing up with a few tough nuts. And those are the tough nuts that, because I'm retired, all of you are going to have to address. Now, if you want to know what it was like to be a planner 50 years ago, when I first joined the city of Vancouver, my very first morning, Ray Spaxman, the director of planning, left me a memo and said, "Ann, there's a meeting with the senior staff at City Hall. Would you attend on behalf of the planning department and do whatever they suggest to sort of approve housing affordability?" Doesn't that sound like today? Now, I don't actually have a picture of that group of people who I met at that first meeting. Partly, there wasn't a camera, but secondly, the room would have been covered with smoke because you were allowed to smoke in City Hall at that time. But the people who were in that room that I went into, while thoughtful, obviously caring about the city, I would suggest probably only had one real life experience and perspective on how to plan a city. Now, look around the room today and see how different the faces are from those who I met that first day. And I must say, they didn't know what to do with me. I actually found later that the city engineer had identified someone, by the name of Adam Burho, an elderly gentleman, much like these. I used to say elderly, now of course I'm even older than them. But he was in charge of doing whatever's necessary to keep that female planner kind of out of my hair, particularly because the city engineer at that time had a map under his desk which was showing where the freeways would go into Vancouver. And he might have thought I might not be supportive of those freeway plans. He was right. Anyway, we can see how different planning looks today. And fortunately, planning at City Hall changed very quickly. Larry, I think your hair's gone a little whiter, distinguished silver, and certainly mine has changed in that time. But not only did we have a lot of creative people at City Hall, also the broad public and a number of people, the Michael Gellers, Jim Moody's, working in the public and private sector at the time, bringing ideas to what became the changing Vancouver. So I'm going to just make a few comments about what changed over that 30 years we were in the city, but then to reflect on whether some of those tools will work today. Some will, I think some won't. In fact, we had a wonderful opportunity over 30 years to go from the Vancouver you see at the top, and I first moved to Vancouver in the 1940s, and it looked somewhat like the top picture, to 2002, when we were named the world's most livable city. Now, I go around the world and people ask me, how did Vancouver do that transformation? And I would think I always reflect on the politicians we had during that period of time. There were 15 different councils that Larry and I served under, and they had both, I would say, left and right-leaning tendencies. But the interesting part was that they all had a set of shared values. They all felt no freeways. They wanted a 24-hour downtown. They wanted livable, sustainable neighborhoods. They were prepared to collect funds from new development, to fund services for new growth, and they were very much involved in public engagement. Indeed, I think the other big issue, and how many of you from Ontario? Well, I always enjoyed meeting with Paul when he was director of planning, because he would say, "Oh, Anne, you are so lucky in Vancouver. You don't have an OMB," which was what it was then. Names changed, but I understand the character and formula is the same. And he also said, "You're so lucky. You have a large council, not a ward council." So that meant two things. One, every councillor had to care about what was happening in the whole city. And secondly, when council made a decision, there was no appeal. So we were able to be very agile. Council could think of an idea, staff would do a bit of scurrying, come up with some recommendations, council would adopt them, and if they didn't work, they could adjust and change. There was no long appeal process going on behind the scenes. So what I'm going to talk about really works in those provinces where local government has authority, works less, I think, where you have an appeal process. Now, that meant that when in the initial council in the early 70s was faced with a freeway going into downtown, council could say no, and no stuck. But I want you to have a look, because I'm going to come back to this later, at the protest sign. The protests are really all about one topic: transportation. No freeway, no third crossing. We'll think in a few minutes about looking at a protest today and the much wider range of issues. Here, they were issues, one issue, and council could deal with it. The city had the authority to build complete communities. Now, I would say when we got the world's most livable city, I, for one, was sitting there with rose-tinted glasses. Isn't this wonderful? Look what the city has achieved. Well, we didn't necessarily achieve all that much. There was some real big chestnuts that didn't get addressed. I happened to find, you know, when you're sitting at home for 2.5 years, you've got time to go through some of your old files, old pictures. And there was a newspaper article in 1976. And I'd just written a report saying the city's losing reasonably priced rental units as they are demolished to meet the market for new condominiums. High-income households are therefore replacing modest income tenants. What does that sound like today? Which suggests, as the city's first housing planner, I obviously didn't do a very good job because the problems have magnified. So being a very livable city had what I think were unintended consequences. We hadn't realized how much that would attract capital from elsewhere in the world, worsening the housing affordability. At the same time, all cities, towns, villages across the country were facing downloading of services from senior governments, meaning with very limited funds, we were having to deal with a lot more issues. I don't know, Larry, did you ever assume that when we created the world's most livable city, we were going to have that kind of investment, attraction of capital? He's shaking his head, no. We certainly know it now. We didn't know it then. So when you look at some of the issues we had to address, and then I compare it with the challenges that you're all facing today, to me, they are much more complex. You're dealing not only with climate change, a variety of issues of equality, equity, issues around reconciliation, issues around sovereignty, likely to be our next big issue in the Arctic. And if you're following the conference, so you're probably not following the news, but Britain at the moment, since Boris Johnson has just resigned and since been overthrown by his own party, between that and Ukraine, there's a lot of global uncertainty, lack of stability in the world. Now, this brought me to thinking about the Iroquois Nation 7 Generations test. And if you're thinking about planning, you should be looking back 7 generations, and I think forward even further. But just to make a personal note, and everybody has their own story, so think of your own story. If I go back to my great-great-grandfather, one of the few things that survived the Blitz bombing happened to be this picture of my great-great-grandfather, my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my dad. Now, the great-great-grandfather lost his land when the enclosures happened in England. His family moved to an industrialized town. In this case, it was a new community called Saltaire. And they didn't really like this planned community. So I'm sure there must be something in my blood about rejecting planned communities. But along came the First World War, where my grandfather was killed in action in France, leaving my grandmother to bring up 2 small children on a very modest widow's pension. She was a nurse during the Spanish flu, continued nursing through the Great Depression. My dad grew up, met my mom, and they got married, and the next year, World War II started. And by the time World War II ended, and we'd lost our house, as many people had in London with the Blitzes, we moved to Canada. Now, think about that compared to what all of us have had to experience, not over the last 3 years, but over the last 50 years. Think of your own, and many of you may have come from areas of the world recently where you've had some of this kind of unrest. But for some of us, we haven't really experienced it until the pandemic. So this raises the question, how much of the planning that we've been doing, where we can regulate land use and fund services through development charges, actually will work where you get the kind of turnaround that we've seen over the past few generations. Now, I don't have children, but for all of you who do, thank you. And what about your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren? Clearly, we're dealing with a mixture of not only internal, but external changes that are intersecting at the same time. In fact, I smiled as I looked at the picture of the aging women. And I remember my first job was actually coloring maps, land use maps in Ottawa. And they gave me a tool called a colored pencil to use to color those maps. And then when I got to university and had to learn how to do mortgage pro formas, have any of you ever used a slide rule? Well, I see one hand at the back. We had to remember the formulas in our minds and use the slide rule to calculate what your mortgages were going to be. Oh yes, oh no is right. It's so easy now, you just pull out your phone and And now I've got to kind of learn how to use the modern technology. So a lot of changes in that way. But remember that earlier picture I showed where there was a protest about no freeways? If you look closely at today's protests, you'll see the wide range of issues, from Indigenous rights to a just transition, to climate change, to affordability. Many more issues, and I would say many of those issues are beyond the scope of local government to address alone. So the question is partly, what baggage do we discard and what can we keep up? And it may be that some of our detailed zoning regulations on design, for example, may have to be discarded as we look at changes. But that's something for you to think about. What needs to be discarded? Now, what do we keep? And I've got two planning tools I'm going to talk about: my portable pocket planner and a talking stick. What's a portable pocket planner? Well, this is my portable pocket planner. I one day was asked by, in this case, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, what's planning? How do you do planning? What are the issues you deal with? And I happened to, in my backpack, have this little piece of string. So I pulled it out and I said, well, when we're planning, we think of sustainability, social, economic, environmental. Are we covering all those issues? And we think about how different people's needs are going to be met through their life cycle, from a child to youth to adult to elderly. And we think about planning as we're doing our plans not only today, but in the future. And of course, the challenge is that this little fuzzy bit right here is actually the current council. And since most of our plans go hundreds or more years into the future, this little council is making decisions which are going to have long-term consequences. The other consequence I have said to people is that the amount of money that we have, as more people come, there's less money per person to provide services. So our little planning tool is shrinking. But there's one thing, I need a help here, because you can't plan by yourself. Back in the old days, it used to be that people tied a string or a ribbon on a finger to remind themselves of something. Now you just put on your cell phone, but that's how you did it. And have you ever tried tying a bow on your own finger? No. So he hasn't practiced either, but that's okay. We'll learn. So it should be a bow, but that's close enough. Yeah, you get an extra credit for that, for the full bow. But what it's saying is that you think when you plan about sustainability and about a variety of needs, you think about the future, but you can't do it all yourself. And that's where I find my little planning tools very helpful, because it reminds me that you need to engage the people who are going to be living in those communities. Now, just quickly running through an example of a piece of work we did, which actually used this little pocket planning tools. And this is some work we did back in the 1770s, when council said they wanted a downtown which was inclusive, including families with children who would have to live at high density. Now, the question was, how do you do that? Well, we did our first thing. We ran literature review. After all, as planners, we borrow and share from others. It's not called plagiarism. It's called borrowing and sharing. But there was nothing to plagiarize. because at that time, the general wisdom was all children should live in the suburbs. And if you were living in the inner city in some kind of public housing, it wasn't working. So most of the pictures were in the United States of developments being demolished. Not much help there. So we assembled our study team of a variety of people, and I'll talk about how we used them as we went through the process. But the critical part was the users. Now, I must be honest, I've already just said, I don't have children. So what's a planner with no children doing, creating design guidelines for families living at high density with children? Well, fortunately, my co-conspirator in this activity was a fellow by the name of Andrew Melcheski. He was an architect, urban designer, and he had 4 children, and he had other children who were temporarily living with him. So with his multiple experience of children, we co-developed the plan using the people who were actually living in various public housing projects. We asked them about their needs, thinking that those were the needs we would have to put into these design guidelines. And most of them were single parents on very low income. But they're the kind of people who were working in the downtown. They were providing service jobs often. All of their ideas were put into some guidelines. And then I think one of the critical parts of the study was getting an architect who had a lot of good experience designing higher density housing in the downtown. But at the same time, also getting a quantity surveyor and a builder. So as we went through the guidelines, we were checking the economics, the design doability, and we were working with the users to see when we had to make tough trade-offs, which trade-offs would be made. We put it all together and created in 1978 some design guidelines for family housing. Yes, those have been updated and amended, but they're pretty much similar today, 30, 40 years later. And I would suggest, if I get any inquiries from other people around the world, it's often on how do you do family housing downtown. And I think the answer is that if you're using your portable pocket planner, including the engagement of the people who are involved, your planning will have legs and it will be useful and usable into the future. But, you know, everything's not success. I can remember some real problems we had with some planning we did. I can remember one study we did, which is totally how not to do a planning study. And that was looking at what do we do after the downtown's developed. Larry was busy developing the downtown, but council was starting to ask, what happens in the rest of the city? So the question was, staff, go ahead and come up with a plan for the rest of the city. Now, actually we did something called the Vancouver Plan, which never gets mentioned. It was approved by council in 1986. And it was a plan where staff went away and we analyzed the jobs, housing, transportation. We went out into neighborhoods, not talking to many people in the neighborhoods, but analyzing what happened when we put higher density housing in a neighborhood. We were looking at NIMBY impacts back in the 1980s. Boy, we thought it all came together. We had our sustainability working. We were thinking life cycle in terms of housing a range of people in these neighborhoods. Council approved the plan. First site to be developed was an old industrial site in the middle of a West Side neighborhood. The community went apeshit, which is a very good planning term, I think. The question is, the plan was totally rejected. Now, from what you've heard in the last two slides, why would you reject the plan? Come on. What were you mouthing, Larry? No public involvement at all. We remembered parts of the analysis triangle, but we did three things wrong. First, we focused on very limited topics: jobs, housing, transportation. And people care about more. They care about parks. They care about amenities. They care about livability in the neighborhood. Secondly, we played the numbers game. You should have seen the number of reports. If I wanted to add them all, I'd have another 100 reports on my CV. We had all this analysis, which in today's terms, I would often reflect are planners who note how many clicks they had on the website. But we had a lot of analysis, but we had no meaningful engagement with the public. So, council was totally frustrated with staff because we'd had a process which was a DAD process. Decide, announce, defend. And council, and I will give Gordon Campbell considerable credit for this, Gordon said, we need a whole new process, and we need a process which is going to engage everyone in the community, having them walk in council's shoes to see what the tough choices are that are being faced by the city. So effectively, we were going to be told to engage the public at every step in the process. There weren't a lot of examples, if any, around at that time of doing this. In fact, most of the planners were like me. We'd been trained figuring we were going to be the captain of the ship. And suddenly, we were in the new age of river rafting. And all of us were in the boat together, trying to develop the plan. And this is where my other planning tool comes in. The Iroquois Nation, but many of other First Nations groups, use a talking stick. And the wonderful thing about the talking stick is that you get a group of people together, and they're not all yelling and screaming at each other. The person, as you know, who holds the talking stick is speaking, but then you turn the talking stick over to someone else, and they get to speak, and they get to say what's on their mind and what the issues are. And to me, that's what public engagement is all about. Now, how did we do that? Council said to us, well, we want to hear from all people. We want to hear about all issues, not just jobs, housing, transportation. And we want to hear in new ways. Go invent those new ways. Specifically, council wanted people to talk to people, people to share their interests and concerns for the city, and try to come to some agreement about the tough choices and consequences facing the city. So we had a group of city circles, as we called. We thought there'd maybe be 25 city circles. At the end, we ended up with around 600, and 70 of them were working in languages other than English, and 150 of them were classroom circles. The school board jumped in, got engaged. So we were having a range of voices around the table, and just jumping ahead a bit on me here. And that range of voices put ideas out on the table, and somehow we had to display and give opportunities for people to discuss all these ideas. So we came up with an ideas fair where everybody put up their circle illustrations and talked to them about what they were proposing. And one of the warmest moments was seeing a group of people from Strathcona area. It was the Elderly Chinese Stroke Association. And they, as a city circle, had come up with the idea of community policing. And there was another group from Shaughnessy, which is our sort of upper income area, what I would call the Shaughnessy matrons. And the Shaughnessy matrons were sitting down together with some interpreters because both of them were interested in supporting community policing. And they were sharing the ideas of how to make this happen in the city. Now, out of this ideas fair, some ideas were really supported, like community policing and greenways, bikeways through the city. And I think one of the mistakes we often make as planners is we wait for the rest of the plan to be finished before we start implementing. One of the things that really worked here was that council put money aside to say, when you're ready with agreement, broad agreement with the city, we'll put some funds into making that happen. Boy, did that ever build credibility as people started to see the community policing offices moving into the community, as they started to see greenways, bikeways being built across the city. Hey, council's listening. We'll keep going. Maybe we'll get more of our ideas adopted. But there were some tough choices. And those tough choices involved people actually having to look at a wide range of topics. I've only just picked 3 here as examples, but the most normal issue that we deal with as planners is the question of where growth's going to go. And when we started the process, I would say 80% of people said growth should either go on the brownfield sites, continue to redevelop the industrial land, or alternatively out of the city. And by the end of the process, we had 80% of people supporting adding more housing in existing neighborhoods. And you know what it was? It was talking, where are my kids going to live? I got gray hair, I'm getting old. I want to stay in my familiar neighborhood. Where am I going to live? And it was that people not shouting at each other, but taking their turns, speaking, that ended up resulting in broad support for adding more housing in existing neighborhoods. But just to see the range, we had about 15 topics people were working on. One of them was clearly, how do we pay for more services? Do we increase taxes, reduce services? And consistent with the where do you locate, add more housing where existing services are. And this wasn't just an issue of land use and planning. A lot of the public was very interested in how we make decisions. Do we stay an at-large council or a ward council? And this was one of my big surprises, because you'd think people who are active and wanting to engage would want wards. In fact, the conclusion was pretty overwhelmingly, people wanted to continue with the at-large system. Maybe more listening to neighborhoods, but still at large. So we heard from a wide range of people in a wide range of different ways, which in all cases had ideas and solutions traveling together. And at the end, and I'd be interested to see, I think they got through all of the council last week, or yesterday, on the new Vancouver plan. I suspect not that many people knew it was even going to council, but in this case, we had over 100,000 people who felt they had been actively engaged. And I can only remember one person who came to the council meeting and spoke against the directions the city was coming up with. And I remember that person because, and excuse my language here, but you deal with the public and this is what we use. This gentleman got up and said, I fucking well don't agree with what's being proposed. If somebody fucking well can't afford to live in my neighborhood, well, they should fucking well go outside the city. And council's sort of sitting there. And Gordon Price says, as was a councillor, well, I take it that you don't agree with the plan. I fucking well don't. Well, I got accused of sort of stage managing the next thing that happened, because the next person who got up was a middle-aged woman, and she was crying. And she said, I don't know who that horrible man was, but I didn't see him in any of my neighborhood meetings. He doesn't speak for me, and he doesn't speak for my neighbors. It was fascinating to see almost no opposition. Now, having done that, we did a whole lot of citywide plans. And those, I think, get lost in the mists of time, but it was the first transportation plan, the first sustainability plan. And other than affordable housing, the first sort of housing plans for the city, the first culture plan, the first policing plan. But we also still had to go into the neighborhoods. And how do you actually get people to support what they've said in theory, in practice? So we went through a series of broad visions in communities and then detailed neighborhood plans with zoning. And people talked about their needs. This was before the internet. So there was no sort of follow up and click, click, click. This was people having to talk to people. And out of these community visions came a variety of areas where people said they wanted to see more density, more choice of housing and services in their neighborhoods. The first one, a place called Knighton Kingsway, which is your typical single-family area. Staff went in, worked with the community, worked with developers, came up with a whole new zoning for the area, agreement on what amenities were going to be funded by this new zoning. We went to public hearing, and I think there was about 40, 50 people showed up at the public hearing one rainy February night. And we thought, oh, what did we do wrong? Why are there so many people here? Well, a couple of people spoke for it, and everybody else sort of said, the mayor said, anyone else want to speak? Anyone else wants to speak? Anyone else wants to speak? Nobody did. Council approved the plan, and the community jumped up and down. They blew up balloons, they threw confetti. Their plan had been adopted. But there's always a but, and this included a plan which involved some pretty extensive development in what was otherwise a single-family neighborhood. And I remember one of our fellows, planning fellows, I don't think Michael's here, but Michael Geller, happened to drive past this when it was under construction. And he phoned me up and he said, what's that? How did you get that approved? He was still trying to get his little townhouses approved on the west side of town. And I said, well, we worked with the community. The bottom floor at the back there is the community's new library, and people added a few stories on the building in order to get a larger space for the library. Everybody agreed. That's how you do it. But the problem was, for all of that cheering, there was not one newspaper story about what had happened. If we'd had a protest, it would have been the front pages, but no stories because no protest. And basically, the whole program blew up. in June 2006. It blew up because it wasn't very timely. It took us 10 years to get from the plan to actual zoning in a neighborhood. And the mayor at the time thought this was taking too long. He came up with his new plan for the city. He gave that plan out to a group of people who were in Kent Town for the World Urban Forum at the time. And it happened that back in 2006, when you turned 65, you were by law expected to retire. So I turned 65 and retired. And Larry, the sot, didn't stay on. He left as well to go do other things. And because the staff spent the next 10 years worrying about how to implement this thing called eco-density, most of them, the creative ones, many of them left as well. And Larry took them with him to wherever he was working. So a lot of loss, not only of time and energy, but also public support for creating more livable neighborhoods. And it only took a few months for the picketers to come out and saying, no rezoning in my neighborhood. So there's a lot of things I'd do the same, but I would certainly move things along faster. And what I would wonder about is, because we did most of this before the web, could we use more tools to engage a broader community? And I don't know. Clearly there's a toss-up between everybody having the ability to engage at any time and place that's convenient to them, versus coming out and taking their time and energy to engage as a group. They're tough choices, but the question is, can you, engaging as an individual, actually come to some of the agreements we came up with, working with people around a table, having to make some tough choices? And I carried on working elsewhere in the world, both in Auckland and in Melbourne. And in both places, the cities were doing plans heavily geared to question and answers and filling in surveys on the web. And Auckland, a city of 1.7 million, had lots of people clicking on the website, and 376 actually put in a comment on the draft plan. Melbourne was the same, 131 actually bothered to respond, and they were individually responding. They weren't having to come up and deal with some of the tough choices. So I would say, yes, it is possible to engage people to agreement, but I don't think we figured out how to do it with today's tools. And the good news is, here's one of the challenges that you've got. Something you need to figure out is how you actually engage people to think about those tough choices. And I'll tell you the one place that a cell phone really helps. It is incredibly useful. You get a group of people around a table and they're waiting for the session to start. And you know what people start doing? They start looking at the pictures. Oh, did you see my new grandchild? Just got a new dog. Oh, where's your grandchildren living? Oh, they're living way up the valley. Sure like it if they could live closer. And what you start seeing is people connecting on a person-to-person basis. So there is one advantage, but I'm leaving it to you all to figure out what other advantages, because I haven't yet seen a survey come out from a city which really got people having to address those tough choices. You're just saying what I want, but how does that work with limited funds? And I'm just going to say a couple of things because I'd like to stop and get some of your comments on an issue that I'm dealing with right now, or a group of us are dealing with right now. If you look over the years, there's been so many reports on housing. We could build housing if we were building paper houses with all those reports. But when you look at the fact that you've got over 1 million renters in Canada who are facing serious affordability, quality, and quantity problems, and we have a 10-year national plan of $72 billion, sounds like a lot, but when you divide it amongst all those people in need, it doesn't come out to very much. And I don't know how many of you have had construction in your communities across the country using the current federal rental incentive program. But at the National Housing Council, we just commissioned some research, and this is public now. That's the upside of working in local government. You can talk about anything, anytime. Working with the feds, you have to sort of zip it until the embargo copies go public. But out has come a report which assesses all this new development that's happening in many communities, and less than 4% of the rental units that are being built are actually affordable to somebody who's currently in core housing need. And if I look, this is within a few blocks of where I live, the new construction that's going up using federal loans indeed is demolishing more older housing than it's replacing with affordable rental. With the many phases of inequity and the right to housing, the question is, how do we tackle this tough nut of limited funds and many needs? And we're clearly able and are doing a lot at the National Housing Council of listening to people with lived experience, but we're doing it mostly on Zoom or one-on-one. And I have yet to figure out how we take all those different needs and respond given the limited resources. And I'd like in a moment, your advice on that. So yes, I have two tools which I've used, my portable pocket planner and my talking stick. But I think the portable pocket planner is going to have to be a lot more complex in the future. You're going to have to look ahead. You're going to be realizing that there's a lot of scenarios that offer different choices. And when I say scenarios, I don't mean 2 leper colonies and a Club Med, which is what so many choices are about. It's 3 alternate futures that will be livable, affordable, but maybe done in different ways. We certainly have to look at participation and resilience and the agility. And I think with COVID, we've realized agility to pause and pivot. And we've got to expect the unexpected. One of the jobs I did about 2013 was in Ukraine. And Canada was putting funding in to put together plans. And the communities worked away on these plans. One community actually said, enough of these plans. We want to use all the money. We had a 1-day planning session and put it into building a well, because it happened to be in Crimea with a one-crop economy, and they wanted some water in order to diversify the crops, and they wanted a couple of trucks so they could take their crops to market. So the Canadian government said, okay, no plan, we'll just build the well. Well, you kind of wonder, at the time, people were so enthusiastic, they were diversifying crops. We had no thought or account that a couple of years later, the whole area would be annexed. I'm for sure know that the sign which said contributed by Canada has been taken down. But the question is, how do you plan with that kind of uncertainty? Hopefully that well is still producing to diversify the crops, but the other areas where we did more traditional plans. Zaporozhye is just a few miles from the Donetsk area, which is now under major fire. Actually, they're not implementing their plan. They're trying to survive. So there's a real challenge as to how we do planning, thinking of the uncertainties that we're facing. So we're certainly going to have to rethink funding. Local governments are taking on much more than they've got the funding to resolve. We certainly need to build partnerships, and I think a lot of that partnership building is actually going to be with the non-market sector, particularly for housing. We need to rethink how to engage users, and we certainly need to look beyond Canada and our local borders, because I think that's where most of the issues are going to be. But the good news is, as I look around the room, and I look, for example, at some of our SCART planners and at all the people who have just received CIP fellowship awards, there's certainly a lot of creativity and energy to try and resolve some of those problems. So, good luck. I will look forward to seeing how you resolve some of these issues. Now, two things. We've got about 15 minutes for any questions or comments, but I'd also be interested in any suggestions you have about how to handle that tough challenge that we've got right now with housing in Canada, with all these different needs that we can hear from. But how on earth do we bring nationally people together to try and make some tough choices on who gets housed and how they're helped? So any suggestions people have on that would be very welcome, because we're right now in the process of the Housing Council of coming up with recommendations to change the National Housing Act funding. And I have a horrible feeling that so many people will have said to us, but you listened to our lived experience. But what did you do with that? How did you help our group meet our needs? So questions, comments, and suggestions on that current problem.
Thank you so much, Anne. So we don't have a volunteer for this session. I'm the roaming mic. Please put your hands up. I don't think we have any questions online yet, but if you are online and have a question, please type it in. Let's see, hands. Got one up here.
Thanks so much for that. Have respected your work for a long time. I work at TransLink in Metro Vancouver, but I also wanted to just say that I, as a professional, have a hard time affording to live in the city that I work and serve in. So yes, we need to address housing for the bottom quadrant, but the missing middle is also an important element. I'm very fortunate to be able to live in the Athletes Village Co-op in the Olympic Village area of Vancouver. And I just wanted to provide it as a really excellent example of housing going forward in the future. Recognizing that the City of Vancouver provided the land on that for the building. And as a co-op, we don't buy into the co-op. Our rent goes towards paying for the mortgage that it costs to build the building, and the upkeep and the maintenance and the long-term capital planning, but there's no profit component. So our rents have stayed stable since 2011. You can still live in a 2-bedroom apartment for under $2,000. And we self-subsidize below market rate units. So we don't get any external funding subsidies. Our market rate housing charges also subsidize those to income-oriented units. So there are 30% of our units are geared to income. So you don't pay more than 30% of your income. And we have people who are on disability, so they're paying very little. and it's a sustainable model for housing going into the future. It's we're like a village within the city. Everyone knows each other. The way that the building was built, it supports all the happy city elements, if you're familiar with Charles Montgomery's work. And it's just, I'm very grateful to be able to live there, and I want more people to have that opportunity at all income levels. What I find the challenge is that the wealth gap is growing because of the commodification of housing. And I feel it. I'm not into the equity side of housing. I feel that. But we're never going to get anywhere if the wealth gap continues to grow and housing continues to be commodified.
Great observations. And I think the wealth gap is one of those things that's really starting as a part of the toxic environment that we're all working in as planners. I think the co-op and nonprofit model is a really good one. It is a way I think you can meet all the diverse needs if you've got sufficient funding that a number of nonprofit organizations can develop and then be used to build the particular housing that your group might want, because you might not have all the expertise. What happened back in the 1970s and early 80s in Canada, there was about 88 organizations that were nonprofit developers. And they were providing housing across the country to meet a range of needs. But the federal government moved out of housing, and all that funding disappeared, and all that expertise disappeared with it. And I think if there's anything that we need to look at as a country is how we get programs like housing programs, much like health programs, something that doesn't disappear as a new government comes in, but something that's seen as an ongoing Canadian support, meaning that these nonprofit groups can grow and can provide assistance. Now, many co-ops are like yours, where there's no equity build-up. There is a bit of a problem with some of the older co-ops, which once they've paid their mortgage, they're starting to sell and make a profit. And I think one of the issues is clearly going to be any new funding going forward not only needs to be more grants, but also needs to be for housing in perpetuity, not for just the term of a mortgage. But I think that some of the answers may be around meeting all these diverse needs that groups have if we could get a better set of organizations that can provide the development side of those services.
Hi, thanks very much. We could talk about the advantageous tax structures for equity, for home ownership, and the systemic problems that the federal government can deal with in that vein. But I think on a more local level, the time it takes to get a project, just to zone land for that project, is astronomical. Taking a page out of the Community Care and Assisted Living Act, back in the 90s, they passed an anti-NIMBY clause in that act, which allows daycares, group homes in single-family residential, and completely removes municipal control from those projects. I'm not advocating for removing municipal control per se, but having stronger legislation that allows for things to happen quickly and doesn't unfairly advantage property owners. We still talk about property owners and renters as being different. They're citizens. Yep. There's no bloody difference. But on all of our councils, I guarantee you your council is treating them differently.
Yeah. I think that you're quite right. They're treated differently, but they're all households, people looking for a home. The one thing that I'm finding, and there was a research paper put out actually this week by CMHC, where a group of their economic researchers were looking at the impact across the country in Toronto, Winnipeg, Vancouver, some of the larger cities, of what the cost of delay in permit processing is. And I just had a quick look at the report, but there was one fundamental issue which wasn't mentioned, and that is how municipalities fund themselves. It's one of those wicked problems. People want more affordable housing. They want to have developments move faster through the process. But at the same time, cities are caught because given the kind of demands for amenities, parks, and services that come with new development, how do you pay for them? The only way you can pay for them is, at the moment, is to charge development cost levies of various kinds. And that slows the process down. Larry and I always had this big debate. I wanted to rezone parts of the city and just let as of right happen. Larry, really dealing with bigger projects than I was, always wanted to take it through the rezoning process so that, as I interpret him, and he can change, but as I interpret, partly it would be the fit of the new development, but also you were getting that additional funding coming out of the rezoning process. And every report I've read recently, which talks about how we've got to speed up the permit processing system, neglects to say the reason in many cases it's slow right now is because municipalities want to go through that extra step of getting the revenue that's going to be needed for the park, the community centers. And that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges we need as a country to relook at how funds are allocated and the responsibilities that local governments have. And it would be nice if senior governments had to balance the budget the same way we do at the local level. But, and I will say one other thing that I've been talking, because I live in Coquitlam, and I frequently talk to them about how things are happening. And I hear more frustration from the planners there because they work so hard to get a permit through to approval. And many of those big developments are sitting for a year or two because the moment they pick up the permit, they have to pay the fees. And so the staff have rushed to get it, the permit ready for pickup, and they're not getting picked up. But those same developers are saying the municipality is slow in getting the processes out. So there are some tension issues here, but I think the fundamental tension issue is the one about how do cities pay for the range of services to make livable communities? And that doesn't seem to be ever discussed in people who are saying how we move the process, permit processing faster.
Thanks.
I'd be interested in some of your
one question up here and a couple in the middle, and then I think we're going to be out of time.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Anne. I grew up in the Manhattan and in Mount Ann Gardens, two wonderful co-ops in Vancouver, went to Strathcona Elementary. I've been a planner for 20 years in amenity regions across BC. And I just started with CMHC 3 days ago. So this topic is really dear to my heart. What I have seen in smaller and mid-sized cities across BC is a lack of decision-making and boldness when it comes to this crisis. Most communities I've worked in have single-family dwellings and apartments and nothing in between. And a lot of that has to do with the unsophistication of municipalities to do the basics. Asset management, making a rezoning, look at your sewer and water capacity. Like, why don't we know that? That is our business to know that. And I totally agree with you that at least in housing and in neighborhoods, that we should be pre-zoning for the kind of housing that we want. I understand wanting to negotiate for amenities, but a lot of time in smaller cities, we're not doing that anyway. So if we can pre-zone for the housing that we want and that we need and make it easier and make it quicker, we'll see more of it happen. And I've seen that in different communities that I've worked in, like Vernon. Kelowna is doing a lot of that. And I also think we need to increase massively the amount of non-market housing that we have, because income levels and pricing is just totally disconnected. So those are some of my comments. Thank you for the work that you've done. The presentation was awesome and inspiring.
Well, I look forward to what you could do with CMHC.
Me too, me too. Let's talk.
Thanks. Okay, as I bring the mic to the center here, and a yes or no question, do you think that engagement processes that occurred during the pandemic, should they have been put on pause because they couldn't be in person, where some of the value seems to be?
I think that it's easy to look in retrospect and say, what would I have done? I know when Vancouver plan, the current Vancouver plan, not the one in '86 that was forgotten about, which we screwed up on so badly. If we had known what the pandemic was going to be and how long it was going to be and the challenge, I think the last thing I saw was that, yes, about 60% of people were willing to engage online, but most of them said, but for less than 30 minutes. Now, have you ever seen anyone come to a resolution on a tough choice about what amenity to pay for in the neighborhood or what kind of development in 30 minutes online? I haven't. So in retrospect, had we known how long the pandemic was going to be, it's easy for me to now say, but what would I have done if I was director of planning? I would have probably paused the current Vancouver plan. I would have taken all of the plans that the city has, put them all into one package. I used to be totally embarrassed when somebody would come in my office and say, have you got a transportation plan? I'd go over and haul it off the shelf. And have you got a culture plan? And I'd haul another plan off the shelf. They were all looked different, felt different. They were all trying to deal with different aspects of a livable city. And I think that one could have, in the case of Vancouver, which didn't have an OCP or a master plan, actually bring all of those plans together in one place, waiting for those tough choices to come through a more of a discussion process. But you know, it's easy to say in retrospect.
Sure. So end the discussion by hearing from a developer. My name is Greg Mitchell. I'm a planner. I am a developer. I work for a company that builds rental housing across the province, so from small communities to big communities. And there's a huge disparity in the processing of those cities. I've had more brain damage for projects in smaller cities than for 1,000 units in the city of Surrey, for example. So standardization of processes across jurisdictions would make life easier for those developers who are trying to do right things. My question to you is, since I consider my area a large spectrum of the need, but I would rather see the emphasis of federal funds and federal efforts to the co-ops, to the below market housing, to the deeply affordable housing in sustainable ways. The co-op that was mentioned just up in front of me here as a great example of that. Would you emphasize the need for that market rental housing across jurisdictions, which we clearly know we need? I think BC needs 40,000 units to get to current requirements, let alone growth.
I think you need two different kinds of programs. You need funding which goes for market rental housing. And as been pointed out, there's great examples of funding for nonprofit and co-op housing, but that funding has to be much enhanced from what it is today. And secondly, it needs to be funding which includes more grants than loans. And it needs to be funding which doesn't rely on sort of 4 levels of government to all come to agreement at exactly the same moment that they're going to approve the funding and the land and the services. And I think that's one of the challenges, is that so many of the programs now require agreement between multiple funders. And they're dealing often with unsophisticated nonprofit and co-op groups. So the more we can build groups that have the expertise in developing nonprofit and co-op housing, fund them with portfolio funding so that they know that they're going to be having X number of units allocated over a period of time, and then do more of it through single source funding, one level of government or the other, but not saying that you're going to have to find all of the people in this room coming to agreement at exactly the same moment in order to get your development approved. I think we have the answers. You just need to put them together. And I think one of the biggest challenges is I look at some of the funding requests that are coming in, and some of the worst housing is actually in the north. And there's reports now that have come out, and again are public, recommending $900 million for improving urban, indigenous, and northern housing. 900 million request, 70 million at the moment, billion I should say, not million, billion request compared to 70 billion for all of the housing programs in Canada. There's not that kind of money, and we'll need to make tough choices.
All right, thanks so much, Anne. Thanks everyone for coming. Enjoy the rest of the conference.